Kant was born in 1724 and died in 1804, just shy of his 80th birthday. And if you need to anchor yourself in time, you can think about 1776 as the date of the American Revolution. Kant lived in Prussia, which was an empire stretching over most of the present-day Russia into today's Poland, Lithuania, and parts of contemporary Russia. Kant's hometown was part of the Soviet Union. When there was a Soviet Union, it's now part of Russia. Prussia was known for its militarism, but also for its freedom of thought and religion and freedom of the press. But those things went back and forth during Kant's life. They were known for taking bureaucracy to the highest level that had been taken in Europe, probably since the time of the Mandarins in China. But they also established the most sophisticated public school system at the time that was imitated in many other places across Europe. They had an enlightened dictatorship. Sometimes it was more enlightened, sometimes it was more dictatorial. So at one point you have Kant's writings on religion essentially banned in Prussia. I'll say a bit more about that. Before and after that period, though, he's encouraged and protected by the Prussian monarchy. The Prussian Empire, as I've said, was very permissive of dissent and of cultural expression in general for much of Kant's life, under Frederick, known as Frederick the Great. But Frederick dies in 1786 and is replaced by Frederick Wilhelm II, who was a much weaker ruler, but one who had an agenda of promoting a rather narrow form of Lutheran Christianity, which he did by persecuting those whom he saw as threatening it. I'll say a bit more about that in a couple of minutes. Frederick William II was anti-Enlightenment, and Kant was one of his major targets. But Kant outlives Frederick Wilhelm II, and who dies in 1797. And as I told you, Kant lives until 1804 and continues to produce new work until close to the time of his death at the age of 79. So what kind of city was Königsberg at the time? Well, it was a port city on the Baltic Sea with lots of commerce. It was the easternmost German-speaking city. The Soviets annexed it, as I said, in 1945 and changed its name at the same time to Kaliningrad in honor of a minor communist official, Kalinin. And they did their best, the Soviets did their best to erase any remnants of German culture. They drove out all the Germans. Kant's tomb is still standing in Kaliningrad and you can visit it, but Kant's body is no longer there. It was stolen in 1950 under mysterious circumstances. I won't try to make too much out of the fact that Kant's tomb is empty. Kant was the first major philosopher to publish books in German rather than Latin. His own early works were in Latin because they were required to be. His dissertation and the inaugural dissertation of his professorship, Kant basically restructured the German language to make it capable of handling philosophy. So if you think about it this way, there were two major influences on the formation of modern English: Shakespeare and the King James version of the Bible. If you look at Germany, those two major works in the transition to modern High German were Martin Luther's translation of the Bible and Kant's Critique of Pure Reason and other writings. So Kant's terminology turns out to have a tremendous influence, not just on how people write philosophy in German after Kant, but you can see all of these Kantian terms in German today, in newspapers, in novels, in how people use the language on the street and in pubs. So Kant's father was a saddle maker. Kant was not poor, he was also not rich. So his father would have been, as a saddle maker, a member of a guild, a member of the stable middle class, but with ties to medieval feudal structures. So the guild system dates into the Middle Ages. The food in the household would have been very modest, decent sized house. So you can think of his dad as something like a skilled blue collar factory worker, um, not a laborer, but let's say a machinist, a plumber, an electrician, a skilled laborer who lives in a house in the less expensive suburbs. So now I have to talk about Kant's health condition. He can't travel, and he has to be very careful about his diet and his exercise in order to stay alive. And that's because his rib cage, he was born with his rib cage compressed toward his spine so that his internal organs could not develop to full adult size, those organs that are in the chest cavity. And a child born at that time with that condition, I forget what it's called, you can look it up, had a life expectancy of about 7 years. So certainly most of those children died in childhood, some of them in early childhood or even in infancy. Kant lives almost until his 80th birthday. Now, Kant's daily walk and his scrupulous care about his diet are often lampooned, but undeservedly. So it's said that the housewives of Königsberg can set their clocks by Kant's morning walk. But think about what Kant was doing. He's essentially not different from people who run on the beach at the same time every day, who count calories, carbohydrate grams, and so forth. What's Kant doing? Well, I used to live very close to Santa Monica Beach, and so I would walk every morning and evening a little bit on the beach. And you would see people at the same time every day, and it was running or walking or biking on the beach. And it was clear they were doing a couple of things. One was they were sleeping as late as they could to still get in their half an hour of exercise, go home, shower, get dressed, and commute to work. And second, they wanted to be on the beach early enough that it would not be so crowded that they couldn't keep their heart rate up because they had to stop in order to avoid running into other people all the time. So this is what Kant is doing. Kant is walking through the business district of Königsberg just before the shops open so that he can walk as late as possible, but keep his heart rate up by not having crowds in the inner city who would hinder him from the pace of his walking. So the people who lampoon Kant for the daily walk and his scrupulous care about his diet seldom give the background that these things are what kept him alive half a century or more beyond his normal life expectancy. Kant, of course, even outlived most of his contemporaries, most of his perfectly healthy contemporaries, whose life expectancy would have been around 50. So Kant went to a religious school that belongs to the movement of Pietism. And you might say Pietism was sort of the Christian fundamentalism of Kant's day. It was a religion that was about right action, about having your own personal contact with God, studying the scriptures, not having a priest, a bishop, a pope to interpret scriptures for you. But it was anti-authoritarian in its own way, but had rigid moral rules about the way of life. It practices extemporaneous prayers, so not written prayers, but prayers that just come from the heart. Kant rejects some of the features of Pietism, but he keeps others. Kant goes to university early. He studies theology, physics, and astronomy in addition to philosophy. He sometimes registered as a medical student. There's no evidence that he ever intended to become a physician, but the medical students were the only ones who were allowed to take natural science courses. And with his interest in astronomy and physics, he wanted to take those science courses, the few that were offered at the university. Kant had strong astronomical interests, and in fact, he does a bit of original work in astronomy. So there is a Kant-Laplace hypothesis that is familiar to students of astrophysics, at least graduate students of astrophysics today, and they often don't know that Kant is a philosopher. I've met a couple of them and they say, oh, you mean Kant, not Kant the astronomer, right? I say, yeah, he also wrote philosophy. The philosophy courses that Kant would have taken were based around rationalism and a version of scholasticism. So the systems of Leibniz, Wolff, and Baumgarten, I'll put up their names toward the end of the video. So once Kant has his philosophy doctorate, he enters a phase called Privatdozent. And a Privatdozent is an unpaid instructor who teaches university courses in private homes in order to retain their teaching credentials. He had a friend who had a house large enough that he could host large lectures, and they would charge a little bit of entrance so that they could pay their rent. So during this time, Kant reads Rousseau and Hume and experiences a transformation in his thinking. So he really rethinks his allegiance to rationalism. He was very attached before this to the rationalist picture, and he holds on to rationalism as long as he can until he sees that skeptical attacks, especially Hume's skeptical attacks, turn out to be successful. I like to say that Kant leaves claw marks behind in rationalism. He's so reluctant to let go of it, but he discovers that he's just not convinced of it anymore, no matter how much loyalty he has to his teachers. Kant is 46 years old when he finally gets his paid professorship. And before that, he lived in a series of rented rooms. He moved from one to the next rapidly because of noise, usually barking dogs, children playing loudly in the courtyard, or in one case, prisoners who were forced to sing hymns at the top of their lungs in the neighboring building. In the period before Kant had his professorship, he would often have dinner with the military officers in the Königsberg garrison, where he would play cards with them until the early morning hours, because Kant was a passionate card player, so passionate that one person who knew him said that he probably had several books worth of ideas, but he would never write them down because he was too busy playing cards. Kant also taught military strategy to officers, actual military officers, based on his own reading of war history. One French general who was traveling through Königsberg asked Kant how many years he had lived in Paris, because Kant knew exactly where all of the bridges and fortifications of Paris were, and his knowledge of them was superior to many people who lived in Paris for their entire lives. So that's one sign of how carefully Kant reads stories about other places. Once Kant got his professorship, that was 1770, he used his salary to buy a house and to hire a cook. He never had very much furniture, and what he had was cheap. He only had one picture. It was a picture of Rousseau above his desk. The purpose of having the cook was so that he could invite people to lunch every day. He never invited senior colleagues who could advance his career. He never invited powerful politicians. He had a couple of friends who were businessmen, including one English businessman, so he may have read a bit of English. he, instead of inviting people who could help him, he invited younger colleagues and graduate students who needed a meal. And these lunches would go on for a couple of hours. They might involve a card game. Philosophical conversation was not allowed. The allowable topics of conversation were essentially religion, current events, and fashions, right? So Kant followed men's fashions very closely for anthropological reasons. And Kant dressed in whatever way was fashionable in that particular season or half decade. And because he didn't want to stand out as being unusual, he just wanted to fit in. And there's a funny story. There was a period where all of the men were wearing these very elaborate silver clasps to hold the collars of their shirts together. And Kant wore them, but he said he was very relieved when they went out of fashion again because they were pain. But he wore them anyway. Kant loved to hear and read travel stories. So it's one reason he has his English friends who are importers, exporters in the harbor invite the captains of foreign ships that were coming through, and read a lot of travel logs. When he got bored doing philosophy, reading or writing philosophy, he had travel logs on his desk and he would pick them up and read one of them. He confessed that he got bored with his own writing sometimes, and that took him to the travel logs. And so all of this sort of substitutes or compensates for Kant's inability to travel because of his health condition. Once Kant had his professorship, he had very heavy teaching responsibilities. He taught about 27 hours a week. At LMU, we teach 6 to 9 hours a week. You look at a place like Stanford and R1 University, faculty will teach 3 to 6 hours a week. Kant is teaching, again, 27 hours a week. He was required by law to teach from textbooks written by others, and he mostly teaches by textbooks from the rationalist tradition that he was raised in, like Baumgarten and Wolff, but he corrects them as he sees fit, and he sees fit an awful lot. Kant is the first, in Germany at least, to lecture on anthropology and geography, and there are no textbooks available in those two subjects. So there's a special law that is promulgated by the king to allow Kant to lecture without a textbook in his anthropology and geography courses. So it's recognized by the Prussian government that Kant is doing innovative work. Kant wrote in the early morning, early afternoon, or late at night, but when he got his professorship, he stopped going down to the military garrison to drink and play cards, and started writing a lot at night. He held office hours at home, which was standard for professors at the time. They didn't have offices. And Kant's life from that moment forward, from 1770 forward, is mostly uneventful, although there are two events I'll mention. Let's have a look at Kant's main writings. So this is a list of Kant's major writings, the so-called three critiques: Prolegomena, Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, which many of you have already read, the Metaphysics of Morals proper, which has two parts: Metaphysics of Virtue and Metaphysics of Right, the Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, which gets him in political trouble, and the Anthropology from a Practical Point of View. Now there's plenty of others. For instance, a set of political essays, which the orientation essay belongs to. There's an essay in that set called Perpetual Peace, which is one of the first proposals for a League of Nations that would later take the form of a United Nations. Kant's collected works run to about 30 volumes. I have a copy in my campus office. And in addition to the ones that I've mentioned, there are important writings on geography and anthropology. So since Kant was the first to turn these into academic subjects. So I said there were two events in Kant's life that made it, that punctuated the general uneventfulness. The first was Kant was twice offered a professorship at the University of Halle, which was much larger, more prestigious, could pay more than the University of Königsberg, where he was teaching. Kant had a friend in the Baron von Sedlitz, who was Prussian Minister of Education, who was behind these offers. Kant turned them down twice because he was afraid he would not be able to finish his writing projects if he took the position. And Sedlitz, this minister, pleaded that the students in Halle needed him. And Kant's answer was that his readers needed the books that he was writing. So Kant was conscious of the importance of his work for his generation and even for posterity. The second event I'll mention happens in connection with that book, Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, as an attack on what Kant saw as the illegitimate exercise of power in the church. Both Catholic and Protestant, Prussia was Lutheran, so Kant's direct attacks are on Lutheran ministers. The king was offended because the king saw Kant as threatening his authority. He was the head, the titular head at least, of the Lutheran state church. And so this was Frederick Wilhelm, of course, he threatened to revoke Kant's license to teach and publish in Prussia, and even to exile him from the Kingdom of Prussia. And Kant got out of it by writing back that he wasn't talking about revealed religion at all, but only about natural religion, meaning those aspects of religion accessible to reason without scripture or revelation, so that the book should not be seen as an attack on the king's authority at all. Still, Kant had to promise not to write and publish about religion and theology in the future. And he did promise that. He held on to his promise until that king died in 1797. And at that time, Kant considered himself released from the promise, since he didn't believe that it was a legitimate demand in the first place. So he regarded it only as a promise to the person of Frederick Wilhelm II, the king of the time, not as the head of state of Prussia. So he does a little bit of jockeying, moral jockeying, to justify that. So one bizarre twist in that whole story is that a large number of Frederick Wilhelm II's advisors were Freemasons. They were not even Christians, much less Lutherans. So it's clear that the Kaiser was using the enforcement of Lutheran orthodoxy as a way of exercising political power, not out of intrinsic conviction. Kant was healthy and he continued to teach up to 2 years before his death. And by that time, he was very ill and confined to his bed. But he continued to write feverishly, trying to complete the book that would be the crowning achievement of his life's work. One of the titles he gave to it was God and the World. It was supposed to reconcile physics and theology. He didn't finish it, but a lot of the manuscript remains. So a couple thousand pages, actually, of handwritten manuscripts. And excerpts are published in English by Eckhard Froeste in the book Kant's Final Synthesis. Again, essentially, what Kant is trying to do is to synthesize religion and ethics on one hand with the physical science on the others. And Kant, in this book to be, an intended book, talks about the embodiedness of human life, the embodiedness of reason, and elsewhere Kant is almost completely silent on any issues related to embodiment. And it's probably because he was experiencing his own embodiment more than he ever had been before. So I just want to mention a few of Kant's interlocutors. Of course, there are the rationalist metaphysicians, Christian Wolff, Alexander Baumgarten, who are roughly scholastic philosophers, a sort of a survival of Thomism into modernity in the form of Wolff and Baumgarten. It's known as the Leibniz-Wolffian metaphysics. Of course, skeptics in epistemological issues like Hume, skeptics in ethical issues like Rousseau. Kant was looking for a third way between these two extremes, and we want to take very seriously that what Kant believes he's presenting is not a balance of the two or a mixture of rationalism or empiricism, but a genuine third way that would be neither rationalistic nor empiricistic. I'll talk more about the philosophers who influenced Kant and the philosophers whom he influenced later in the seminar. But suffice it to say that scarcely any philosopher who's written after Kant has neglected to take some position on Kant's philosophy or to engage Kant's idea in some form, positively or negatively. There is no way of getting around Kant in modern philosophy.